Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Globus for Google Drive webinar. My name is Vas Vasiliadis from the University of Chicago Globus team. And also joining me on the webinar, helping answer your questions, is Steve Tiki.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I see a lot of people still joining, but we have a fair amount of material to cover, so I'd like to jump right in. So what I plan to talk about today is give you a very brief overview of what Globus is for those that are new to the service. And then I'm going to focus the rest of the discussion on Globus for Google Drive, what it can do for you, some various use cases and scenarios where we found it to be useful and other researchers have found it to be useful. And then talk a little bit about how you can actually deploy this on your campus at your institution and take advantage of all this wonderful storage that Google is making available to the research community. And as we go along here, there is a chat window on the right side of your screen. And please put your questions in there. Steve will be answering some of those directly. He may prompt me to answer some of those live. If you can't see or type into the chat, you may have to create a channel. I think YouTube requires you to do that. So just click on your Google icon on the top right and then create a channel and you should be good to go. Okay, so what is Globus? So Globus is a service that delivers data transfer, sharing, publication, and discovery directly from your own storage systems via SaaS. What does that mean? So we have a number of capabilities that are targeted at supporting data management throughout the research lifecycle. And these capabilities are deployed or made available directly off your own storage systems. Globus does not provide storage. We don't see your data or store your host or relay your data in any way. We're just a value-added service, if you will, that you can add to your storage systems on campus and elsewhere and just access them via a browser or via other user interfaces that I'll talk about later on. So just walking through the flow of the various capabilities that Globus offers. We started out with file transfer. That's something that's been out there and available to the community for over 7 years now. So we call this the fire and forget mode of file transfer, right? So without having to sit there and worry about getting a large data set transferred from one system to another, a researcher can come along, request the transfer in the Globus service. The service will take over from that point and make every effort to get the data over to the other system reliably, securely, and as quickly as possible. And it'll work through any transient errors that it encounters along the way. The other area that we've seen a lot of growing usage on recently is in the area of sharing. So typically when I want to share something from a local system on campus with people outside of my institution, or perhaps even with people on campus that don't have access to that system, it can be a pretty cumbersome process. With Globus, all you need to do is, as the owner of the data, via the Globus service, grant permissions to the users that you want to have access to the data, be they local users or halfway around the world. Globus will track those permissions and make sure that's all those users can access, and they can come along via Globus, log in, access the data, move it to their own systems, and do what they will with it. And then on the back end of the life cycle, if you will, we may have some data that we wish to publish for access to make it available to a broader community. So Globus allows you to pull data together from multiple systems, put it into a repository that you again designate. This is again all on your own storage systems. You can describe it with some metadata, optionally put it through a curation step, and then make it available for other researchers to come along and search and discover it. And all of this is available via a web browser. You can access pretty much any type of storage system. There are many different varieties of storage and file systems and object stores out there today. We're working frantically to support as many of those as we can. We do have quite a number that we support currently, and Google Drive is one of those, obviously, that we're going to be talking about today. And very importantly, all of these capabilities can be accessed using an existing identity, your campus login, for instance, or perhaps if you work at one of the national labs or a federal facility. So for many of you out there, you should be able to literally go to the website and log into Globus and use it right now. So the other way I like to think about Globus is that it's a bridge that connects researchers and their data. And specifically to the Google Drive product that we're talking about today, this is a bridge to the data on your Google Drive, right? So the same way I can access my local storage systems, my campus computing, my HPC cluster, my lab server, what have you, I'd love to be able to access my Google Drive the same way and have essentially free, sort of seamless, frictionless, whatever buzzword you want to use, data flow across those systems. So some scenarios that we've seen where this becomes really important, a very common one is, hey, I just want a simple way to back up my data, right? So I've got some data sitting on a server in my campus lab. So I want to set up some recurring transfers with the option to sync the data periodically, and maybe I want to schedule that as a cron job or some other scheduled task that runs at some predetermined time on some schedule, and have that dump the data onto Google Drive, right? Another use case that's becoming a big driver of these kinds of capabilities, or the need for having this kind of capability available, is all these instruments that are generating literally terabytes of data per day, including next-gen sequencers. There's a lot of high-res imaging devices out there, like light sources and cryo-EM microscopes more recently. And typically, because these are shared resources and very expensive, the researchers, the experiments that are run on here, they have to get their data off those devices pretty quickly so that the next group of researchers can have access to the machine. So one good use case for Google Drive is to be able to take the data off of those instruments and stage them somewhere for downstream analysis, right? So you can just put them on Google Drive, and then from there you can move them to other systems if you'd like to do some high throughput computing or what have you on those data. A third use case is automating data distribution and essentially making your data available to a larger group of folks. So very common scenario here is, I've developed a data set that may be some type of reference data that others can use or want to use in their research. Perhaps I'm working in climate research or in genomics, what have you. So I have my data on some storage systems. I'm showing an HPC resource here, but it could be any system essentially. And I can put it onto Google Drive via Globus, and I can enable sharing and make that accessible via various mechanisms to other people in the community. One way we are seeing people starting to do this is by building some kind of data portal using the Globus service in the background via our APIs, and then that allows them to customize the workflow by which external users or users in their community can come and get the data. And then one last scenario here is the ability to sort of make your data management plans a lot simpler than they might be today. So everybody who's working on federally funded research has a requirement to publish the data as part of a data management plan and to demonstrate. In some cases, more recently, we've heard from the NIH that they even require you to have a data sharing plan. So you need to have some fairly robust and reliable way of making data available for an extended period beyond the end of your research project. So with Globus, you can pull data from a diverse set of storage systems. You can sort of assemble it, as we say, describe it, curate, as I mentioned earlier, and that's an optional thing. And then you can put it out on Google Drive and then have Globus assign a persistent identifier that you can then use as part of other publications or share with the rest of the community. So how does all this work behind the scenes? So we see here the Google Drive. This is the storage up in the cloud. What we start with is a Globus endpoint, which is essentially a system that has a Globus, some Globus software loaded on it, which we call Globus Connect. So typically an administrator would do this. They would install what we call Globus Connect server. They would add this Google Drive connector to that system, and then a researcher can come along and enable their access to their Google Drive by creating a Globus share, a shared endpoint. And I'll show you just a couple minutes here how we do that. Right, so multiple researchers can come along via this gateway, if you will, and access their Google storage. They can be from within your institution, from other domains. It's really up to you as an administrator to decide who can use this gateway to access what. And then once that's in place, you can start moving data. Globus will control both that that set of Google Drive endpoints. And I'm showing this with this dotted line here. So it's controlling both the endpoints to make sure that the data are transferred reliably. And the data, as I'm showing here with this thick blue line, is flowing directly between Google Drive and some other set of endpoints that you designate going through this gateway. So that's at a very high level what the architecture, if you will, of the Globus for Google Drive looks like. So I'm going to switch over here now and show you on our live service what this looks like. Just give me a second while I switch over to my browser. Okay, so here we are on the Globus homepage. I'm going to go ahead and log into Globus. And I just want to pause here for a minute and talk a little bit about the way you access the system. I mentioned you can access it using any existing identity or many sets of identities. We currently trust about 400 or so different identity providers. Most of them you can see are other universities and various other institutes around the world, including things like Google, Orchid ID. So I'm just going to go ahead and log in with my University of Chicago username and password. And I had logged in just earlier, so that's actually been cached for me. Otherwise, it would have redirected me to University of Chicago, and I would have logged in via that system and come back to Globus. So here I am in Globus, and I'm just going to show you a quick transfer. So I'll go back to that scenario of I have some data on my server, on my campus computing server. In this case, on our campus, it's the Midway cluster that I use. And I want to move that to Google Drive, right? And you'll see here I'm clicking on these things that we call endpoints. Again, these are systems that have the Globus Connect software on them that allows them to be accessible via the Globus service. So I'm going to connect to my Google Drive. And then you'll see this is just like viewing Google Drive directly in your browser, right? So if I switch over actually to a browser and show you my actual Google Drive, right? My drive, team drive, shared with me, etc. It's all the same. So I'll go into my drive, and I'll just do a quick transfer here. I'll just select this directory with whatever files it has in it, and I'll click the button, and you'll see it says transfer request submitted successfully. So Globus is now going to go off and move this data from my campus cluster up to Google Drive to my drive folder. And it's basically not going to bother me unless it hits some kind of error that it can't recover from. And this should complete very quickly because it's a small transfer. So that's really all it takes to transfer. I can also, once the data are up there, I can share them, as I said, with others. So let's say I wanted to share this Gene DRCA directory with some other set of users. I can click on permissions, and I can tell Globus who I would like to share this with, right? I can share it with an individual user, a group of users, all logged in Globus users, or the public. So let's just say I have a user whose username I know, and if you don't know, you can just throw in an email address here, and it'll just send the user notification, and they can access it that way. So I have an option to add a message. Otherwise, I can just click add permission. And now this demo doc user can go to that, can go access the data on my Google Drive, even though they don't have access to my Google Drive. And the nice thing about this is, yes, like people ask, well, I can share directly from Google, but I don't know if you've been in this situation, but certainly I find a lot of cases where I'd like to share with someone, but they end up having multiple Google accounts. I think I'm now up to about 16 accounts in my in a Google Drive, and so I don't necessarily know which account to share it with, right? And if I share it with the wrong one, then I get another request saying, "Can you please grant access to this other account?" and so on. So it becomes a little convoluted. This way, it's nice and clean. You can have a consistent way of sharing your data, irrespective of whether it lives on your campus system, on Google, or what have you. So I mentioned there's this step where your administrator sets up this gateway, and then you can come along and access your Google Drive. I had already set this up, but I'll show you what that looks like. So I have one of these gateways set up here. So here's my Globus for Google Drive gateway. What I would do is go here to my shares and add a shared endpoint. And so let's say I wanted to share, again, create another way of accessing that same Google Drive under Globus. So I can select which Globus, which Google account I'd like to use for this, and then give it a name. So this is my Google Drive demo endpoint, AP endpoint, and that's all there is to it, right? So now what I've done there is I've told the Globus service that there is a Google Drive out there which I have access to, and it's been configured so that I can access it via that gateway that was set up previously. So I can just now click on transfer. It will drop me again back into my Google Drive. I can go look at my data, and I can do all the same things again. So that's really it in a nutshell as far as how you set up a Google Drive, how you use it, and how you share data from it. We'll be answering, I'm sure, a lot of questions on this. So I'd just like to switch back here and talk about a couple more things. Just give me a second. Okay, so I mentioned this thing called Globus Connect as the software that turns your storage system into a Globus endpoint. In other words, makes it accessible via the Globus service. So what Globus Connect does is it deploys, well, when you install Globus Connect, it deploys a number of components on your storage system and configures them automatically such that any user that has local access or local account that can access that system can now access that system via Globus. And by default, Globus Connect service supports POSIX compliant file systems, but we've been adding, as I said earlier, a whole set of connectors that make it available on various other systems, including Google Drive. So if you sort of look one level deeper here, within the Grid FTP server, which is the underlying transfer component, there are a couple of parts to it. There is this POSIX compliant connector, if you will. And then what you can do is you can add to that configuration to enable Google Drive, HPSS, as you can see here, S3, and a number of other external or sort of non-POSIX file systems. So just to recap then, why would you want to use Globus to do this? One of the big advantages of accessing Google Drive and other systems via the service is that you have this consistent user interface. It's easy to access because you're not having to remember multiple usernames, passwords, etc. And it makes it fairly trivial to collaborate with others, as you saw me just sharing with a couple of clicks from pretty much anywhere, any of these systems that I have access to. I mentioned this notion of fire and forget, so you trust that Globus will get your data there reliably. We do have a number of ways to sort of optimize performance. We really try and really maximize throughput on the wide area network for all of these transfers, but we do trade that off against reliability, right? It doesn't help to get the data there really quickly if we're risking any type of any level of corruption. And because it's SaaS, this is a fairly low overhead thing. We've heard people over and over saying that, you know, once they've got it installed, it really doesn't need much care and feeding. It just kind of works, and we're always gratified to hear that. And it's also something that's very automatable. So a lot of the flows that I mentioned earlier in my examples would certainly benefit from being automated, where you can just set something up and just have it run and be assured that your data is being backed up or distributed or transferred, what have you. And you can do that because we have a number of different interfaces, which I'll talk about in just a second. But an even bigger point for many folks is that Globus does give you access to this large and growing community. We now have, I think, upwards of 50,000 such endpoints that are registered on the service at any point in time. There's a few thousand of these that are active. So there's a good chance that someone that you're working with already has an endpoint on their campus, and if they don't, they can actually set one up pretty quickly, even on their own personal machine, their laptop or desktop or what have you. And so what you saw earlier was accessing the service via a web browser. We also have a fully functional command line interface, and actually that exposes a bunch of additional options beyond what's available through the web. And then there is a full REST API that you can talk to. For example, I showed you that data portal example as a way of accessing the data. That's something that you could very easily build, and we have built such a thing as an example. That's open source code that's out there. So you can see how you can talk to Globus programmatically as part of your workflows. So if you'd like to get access to Globus for Google Drive, the way to do that is you would need to have a Globus subscription. So Globus has this freemium model where file transfer is free to use in research and education settings. But some of these other features that I've showed you, like the file sharing and access to these non-POSIX file systems, requires a subscription. And then you can add the Globus for Google Drive to that subscription. As an administrator, as I mentioned earlier, you would have to install this Globus Connect server, and I've got some links on this slide to the documentation for that. And then as a user, we have a simple how-to guide on creating that Google Share that I just did with a couple of clicks there. So, and all of this information is accessible via these URLs on this page. So in closing here, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This is the various groups that have funded the development of Globus over the years and continue to fund it. As I said, we are working towards sustainability. We've seen substantial growth in the service over the last few years since we launched it in 2017, almost 7 years ago. These are some of the numbers. So we've got nice sort of trends of more and more users coming on board. And then we have a number of folks that have chosen to subscribe, and we're very grateful to them for helping us work towards sustainability. So thank you to all our subscribers. We have a number of resources for you out there if you choose to use Globus. We have what I believe is a very responsive help desk. We have a customer engagement team that can work with you to make sure Globus is working nicely on campus. And lots and lots of documentation online that you can reference and access via various channels. So that's what I have for today. I'm going to pause there and start taking questions, although I'm sure Steve has been answering questions as we go along here. Steve, if you want to go live, if you want to repeat anything, let me know.
Yeah, I was just coming off mute. Yeah, so I think I've answered virtually all the questions that have come along on the live chat. I think there was one question about the model a little bit, just to clarify, that the Globus for Google Drive, it's not meant to replace like an HPC file system that's mounted into a set of compute nodes or anything like that, but rather meant to be a distinct storage system that you can use as another tier of storage or another alternative of storage besides that file system. Any other questions people want to put on the chat? The one thing I will repeat from the chat, I know a few people asked about box support related to this, and as I said on the chat, just contact us at support@globus.org if you are interested in that. We're trying to gauge interest in that as another option here, similar to the Globus for Google Drive. Okay, we have a question. Is it subject to the rate limit of Google Drive? Do all users share the same rate limit? Vas, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So yes, all sort of client applications, if you will, that access Google via their APIs are subject to certain rate limits. So Globus is subject to that, and we actually have had a couple of our early customers hit those pretty quickly. There are two ways around that. Well, we actually do two things to address that, I should say. One is that you can reach out to Google and have them raise those rate limits. But even if you don't do that, or even if you still hit the sort of increased limits, the nice thing about Globus is we have this reliability layer, so it will back off gracefully when it starts hitting issues with rate limits. And ultimately, it may just take your transfer a little longer or a lot longer to complete, depending on what you're moving and then how many times you're hitting the API. But the point is it will complete reliably, despite some of those limits being in place.
All right, another set of questions seeing are around, what will the Globus for Google Drive work with? As I replied in the chat, you can do transfers between Google Drive endpoints and any other endpoint, other Globus Connect server endpoints, Globus Connect personal endpoints, and all of this works today. So it'll work with do transfers to and from existing Globus Connect servers. One question is, when will we be able to use the existing endpoints to the new version that supports the connector? Vas, do you want to take that?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that question, Steve.
Basically asking when can they add the Google Drive connector to their Globus Connect server? When can they upgrade existing endpoints to the new version that supports this? Right? As I said, we can do transfers to and from any other endpoint, but I think this question is asking, if I've already got Globus Connect server installed, what do I do? How do I upgrade to make use of?
So right now, setting up that Google Drive gateway, as I termed it, requires that you set up a separate system, a separate data transfer node, if you will. That we're moving away from that, and we're going to be converging over the next some number of months the code base such that you can actually have a Globus Connect server, a single data transfer node that supports multiple different types of file systems. So you could have your POSIX file systems mounted on that, as well as having access to using that as a gateway to Google Drive. But at this point in time, you would actually have to set up a separate server to serve as that Google Drive gateway.
Another question asked is, if someone wants to transfer a file to Google Drive, do they need a Globus Connect server on their end to get Globus transfer speeds, right? So again, the model here is that, what we expect is that organizations will, who have a subscription will install a Globus Connect server, and they can set policies as to what users can use that Globus Connect server as their gateway to and from Google Drive. And then once you have that set up, then the transfer speeds with that are essentially limited by the transfer speeds to and from that gateway box. Another question: how is massive data migration handled? Maybe Vas, you want to just talk a little bit about some of the reliability stuff, and then another question for you to address while you're at it is price of the connector.
Right. So massive data is, of course, a relative term, but Globus is, I think, known for being able to handle very large volumes of data, both in terms of numbers of files, sort of numbering in the many millions in some cases, and size of files. So there's really very little difference to that statement with respect to Google Drive. Modulo, some of the things I mentioned earlier about rate limits, right? So you would end up taking sort of a lot longer, perhaps some cases, to move a massive data set to Google Drive, because you would bump up into those rate limits, but again, the reliability layer would kick in. There are also, I believe, some limits that Google is setting as far as how much data volume can be moved within certain time windows on accounts. Again, if we were to hit that limit, if you're moving something via Globus and you were to hit that limit, again, the Globus service would back off and resume, whenever that restriction expires. So we're continuing to evolve this, obviously. So I'm sure there will be changes that Google makes to the service on an ongoing basis. We will try and stay abreast of those and make sure that, again, from a reliability standpoint, we're not making any compromises. Regarding pricing, the Google Drive connector is priced similar to our standard subscriptions, which the price varies based on your institution's Carnegie classification. That's for most U.S. universities. That's what we use as the scale. We also have a similar pricing scale for national labs and other federal facilities. The range for the very smallest institutions is $1,250 per year, $1,250 per year as an add-on to the standard subscription, and it goes up from there.
Another thing I'll mention too, based on a number of the questions, is that the Globus gateway, Globus for Google Drive, also works seamlessly right alongside existing Google Drive. Right? We're not replacing anything or hiding anything. We play well and cooperate well with Google Drive. So the Google Drive will continue to work right alongside this as well.
Right, and just to add to that, a lot of institutions that have the the G Suite for Education and have this unlimited storage option, they're creating team drives for various groups, and Globus for Google Drive works within that structure also, so you can access your team drive just like you do your personal drive.
Right, so one of the questions is when's the best time to move data? Can Google recommend a time window where network is free? So the model on Google Drive is that Google Drive does not charge for network bandwidth out or in, right? It's just based on storage. The Globus Connect server, can run wherever you want. So a very typical deployment will be to run the Globus Connect server, say, on your local campus as the gateway to the Google Cloud, in which case, you won't get any charges for data transfer in and out of the Google Drive. Vas, another question about what about Azure?
So Azure is one that we haven't seen as much demand for. Steve mentioned that we are adding to our list of connectors or systems that we support via connectors. Azure is starting to come up a little bit more in recent discussions with institutions, but we haven't seen as much demand. We may at some point address that. The model for us is in supporting one of these non-POSIX file systems is to find some source of funding that will help us with the initial development, and then have some assurance that there are sufficient institutions out there who would be willing to subscribe, so we can, again, continue to have this thing be self-sustaining. So right now, that's something that, as I said, we've heard about, but is not currently in our development plans.
Yep, and again, if you're interested in any other systems, don't hesitate to drop us a note at support@globus.org and let us know. That's how we gauge interest in a lot of this stuff. All right, any other questions? I'm not seeing anything at the moment on the live chat. Will I be able to move a file from Google Drive to the Globus gateway? Basically, the answer is it depends on how this gateway is configured. If this gateway is also configured as an endpoint to other storage system, I mean, to first order, no, the gateway is a gateway to pass data through between some other endpoint. But I think, as Vas mentioned earlier, with the new version of Globus Connect server with Google Drive, it will be able to support multiple file systems on that or multiple storage systems on that single Globus Connect server. So you would be able to use that one Globus Connect server installation for multiple purposes there. And then the question is, each non-POSIX connector priced separately?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Each non-POSIX connector priced separately.
Yes, they are priced separately, and the pricing varies on the type of the connector. They're typically in the same sort of ballpark order, a few $1,000s a year, depending on the nature of the connector. If you have a specific question on pricing, specific connector of any of the ones that we currently support, please, again, send us a note, support@globus.org, and I'll be happy to answer those.
Two other questions. Could one gateway be used for multiple Google domains, or is there a limitation or issue with the OAuth that limits it to one domain? No, you can use a gateway. You can use the Globus Connect server gateway with multiple Google domains. You, as the Globus Connect server administrator, can configure one or multiple or all domains that you'll allow to be gatewayed through your device. And are there other object storage connectors either available or in the works? Bass, you want to take that?
Yes, certainly. So actually, our very first object storage connector was a native S3, Amazon S3 connector. So that we've actually recently revamped, and there's a new version of that. So that's been out there for a while. We also have a Ceph S3 connector. So if you're using OpenStack via Ceph, the Rados gateway, which is S3 compatible gateway, you can access that. There's a separate connector for that, and then a couple of others that will talk to backend systems via an S3 API. So Spectra Logic is the one that we announced about a year ago. So that talks to backend tape and other nearline storage via an S3 API. And then we are in the process of developing a couple more that will have more news around the supercomputing timeframe.
All right, I think that's it for the questions on the chat. So we can go and wrap it up then.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for joining. Again, as Steve said, any questions, please direct them to support@globus.org. And we hope to see you using Globus. Thanks. Bye.